I'm pleased to talk with you tonight about strawberries. And since I'm a professor, I always start with a quiz. So here's my quiz. And so what do you think causes the most dollars to come over the cash register at the supermarket? Bananas, apples, citrus, berries, or grapes? What do you think the annual retail value of the US strawberry crop is? You got some choices there. Just sort of make a mental note or write it down. What do you think is the most widely grown fruit crop in the world? You got some choices there. And then how much energy is invested to produce and deliver 1 calorie of energy to the supermarket in the form of a strawberry? So you can think about those questions. I'm going to answer them as we go through our talk tonight. And what I want to talk about is sort of the history of the strawberry and how the strawberry moved from sort of a very sustainably grown crop to one that's now not very sustainable. And my premise is that so much of our food now is grown in very narrow areas of the world, just very restricted areas. And the genetics behind those fruit crops and vegetable crops are so narrow because they're specifically adapted to those areas. So the risk is if something goes wrong, our food supply is really vulnerable because we grow all of our crops concentrated in certain areas. And I would argue that that's not very sustainable. And if we could spread it out a little bit and grow these crops in more places, we'd be in better shape. So berries account for most of the dollars going across the cash register at the supermarket when you look at the fruit crops as a whole. 18% of all the money spent on fruit is spent on berries. I think that's probably surprising to some people, but they're not the biggest in terms of volume. The biggest fruit sold in terms of volume or weight are bananas. What's interesting about that is it's not even a crop that's grown in the United States, and yet it's our #1 fruit crop. So right there is should raise a flag for us that our major fruit that we eat, the biggest one, the most important one, isn't even grown in our country. And then the other problem here is that there's a lot of genetic diversity out there, but growers and producers really have very narrow numbers of varieties that they grow. Like there are 70 species of bananas, but almost all the bananas grown are this one variety of Cavendish. And of course, when you're only growing one variety, it's at risk for all these diseases that variety is susceptible to. And that's not just true for bananas. 20 species of avocados, almost all of them are the Haas variety. And this is because supermarkets and the food chain knows how to handle those bananas. They know when to gas them with ethylene, they know how to treat the avocados. And because they're all the same, they can do everything uniformly. They don't have to deal with different requirements for these different varieties. So you just pick one and go with it. Kiwi fruit, 60 species, almost all of them are just one variety of one species. Same with potatoes, 1,000 varieties of potatoes out there, 70% are just one variety. It's pretty crazy. And we have the same situation with strawberries. 90% of all the strawberries are grown in California. Some say 95%. So we've really concentrated our production into these small regions of the world and of the country. And that makes us vulnerable to all sorts of things, climate, pests, and so forth. In California, 95% is annual production. In other words, they plant the strawberries and grow them for a year, harvest the fruit, and then tear them out and replant again the following year. 3 billion pounds are produced each year. That's $6 billion a year people pay for strawberries in the United States. Unbelievable. The reason they grow them in these places in California is because in these certain locations, the yields are really high. So they can get 60,000 pounds per acre in certain regions of California. The rest of us, Washington, New York, we're 11, 12,000 pounds per acre. So the yields are 5 times as much. So there's a reason why they do that. But there's also a price that we pay for so letting that happen. So I want to go back in history and talk a little about the strawberry and where it came from and how it's grown today. So strawberries were once one of the most sustainably grown crops in the world. They were grown in almost every country, so production was spread out all over the place. Lots of varieties were used. Not a lot of inputs went into it, and they were perennial. In other words, you could plant them one year and fruit them for 3 or 4 years before you had to plant again. You weren't into the system where you had to plant every year. There's a famous book called Small Fruits in New York, published in 1925, and the author of the book noted that there were 134 varieties of strawberry most commonly cultivated in North America, 134 varieties. And now we're down to just a handful. Back then, in 1925, the leading states were those highlighted in pink. I'm not sure if Washington was discovered then. I'm not sure in 1925. But it wasn't a big producer. And that's because, of course, most of the population was in the east, and that's where the strawberries were grown. But the West Coast, California wasn't a player. Florida wasn't a player in 1925. But that all changed over the next few decades. Strawberries are grown in like every country of the world, just about. They're the most widely grown fruit crop, not in terms of volume. Grapes have that recognition, but strawberries are the most widely grown. You can figure out how to grow strawberries just about anywhere in the world. And here's some photos, upper left-hand, Japan, China in the middle, Myanmar, Belgium, Zimbabwe, China again. They're just really adaptable to lots of different places around the world. So the question is, how do we go from a sustainably grown crop where lots of varieties grown all over the world, the production was spread out in lots of different places, the risk was spread out, to concentrating our production in just a few places around the country? So we have to go back to the Europeans. When they came to the colonists came to us, now the United States, they found species of strawberries that they weren't familiar with. The species of strawberry that was grown in Europe was found in the wild in Europe. It was really small. And you can see how small this fruit was, really hard to pick. And people ate it, but it wasn't like a major part of the diet. These strawberries were diploid. They had 2 sets of chromosomes. And oftentimes in fruit crops, the more sets of chromosomes a variety has, the larger the fruit. So when the colonists, and so this is where the diploid species is found all over the north temperate regions of the world. When the colonists came to what's now the United States, the New World, they found strawberry species with 8 sets of chromosomes. There was a species on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And because it had 8 sets instead of 2, the fruit size was larger. And so here is the East Coast species, this large fruit size. And then they found just recently how that all happened, how strawberries went from being 2 sets of chromosomes to 4 to 6 to 8. And there's like a little map here that shows how the hybridization went and how the chromosome doubling went. And that's not really important for tonight, but they just discovered that in 2019. So that was, before that, it was really a mystery. But we have these 8 chromosomes, 8 sets of chromosomes in these North American species. And Jacques Cartier, when he was exploring up the St. Lawrence River and all, he collected these strawberries and sent them back to France, because France at that time was a big collector of plants. They had botanical gardens and collected plants from all over the world. And so that was a big deal. And then that was the East Coast species. And then this guy, Emily Frazier, he was a spy for the French, but he was posing as a merchant in Chile. And he was buying and selling things, but he was really spying on the Spanish to see what they were up to in Chile. But he noticed these big strawberries down there, and he sent them back to King Louis in France for their botanical garden. The problem was he sent these back and with a note, and it said, "You won't believe the size of these strawberries. They're huge. And when they fruit this spring, you'll be really impressed." Well, they flowered in the gardens in France, but they never set fruit. And this is the size of the fruit in Chile, and it's pretty good, but no fruit in France. They couldn't figure out why these strawberries with big fruit in Chile didn't produce any fruit in France. The reason was that the western species is dioecious. It has male plants and female plants. So when you dig up plants with fruit, you're only digging up female plants. Then you send them halfway around the world and plant them in France. Well, there's no pollen to pollinate the flowers. So they flower, but they don't set fruit. So that was what was going on. But in the 1700s, when they planted this eastern strawberry next to the Chilean strawberry, then the Chilean strawberry produced fruit because the pollen from the Virginiana species pollinated the Chiloensis species. And you got fruit, and it was big fruit. So, you know, Amadee Frazier was redeemed. And then when they took the seeds from those fruits and planted them, they got even bigger berries. And at first they didn't know what was going on. They called it the mystery berry, but all of a sudden these strawberries were getting really big. They couldn't figure out why. Well, the reason was you had hybrid vigor in addition to the 8 sets of chromosomes. So you had to cross these 2 species, got hybrid vigor, 8 sets of chromosomes. The strawberries are really big. And so people started growing these all over Europe. And it was called, for some reason, it reminded people of pineapple. I'm not sure why, but they named it the pineapple strawberry. And the genus Fragaria means fragrance. And the species Ananassa. Ananassus is a genus for pineapple. So put it together, pineapple strawberry. And for the next 200 years, both in Europe and in the United States, people grew this hybrid strawberry, Fragaria ananassa. It was a perennial strawberry. You planted it, you let the runners grow, and then you picked the fruit every spring. They were short day varieties, meaning that they form flower buds under the short days of fall and the cool temperatures of fall. They make flower buds. Those flowers would overwinter in the crown, and they would open up in the spring, and you get your fruit. Then when the days are long, like they are now in the summertime, the plants would make runners. So it's hot, long days, runners, short days, cool nights, start making flower buds. So that's what we did. We had these strawberries, they were perennial. We picked them June, part of July, and then they were done for the year. And you come back again next year. So we got this peak in June, July, and that was it. And it was in the second year. First year you planted them, they didn't produce fruit. Because you plant them, they have to produce runners and go through a short day cold temperature cycle, which they haven't done until they get to that first fall. And then they produce their first fruit the following year in the second year. And people bred those, and mostly what they did was they made the fruit larger. So this is a really popular variety, Sparkle, in 1942. And you can see the fruit is bigger than the wild strawberries I showed you earlier. They about doubled or tripled the size. And they made even more progress, and today strawberries are even bigger than that. A big breakthrough in strawberry breeding happened in the 1970s. This fellow here named Roy Springhurst from the University of California remembered when he was a boy, he lived in the Wasatch Mountains in Utah. And he remembered picking strawberries up there in the mountains. And he reasoned that if these strawberries are producing fruit way up in the mountains, and the only time plants grow up there because it's so cold is between, say, May and September, well, those day lengths must be they're long. So those strawberries must not be too strongly short day plants, because the only time they can grow is under long days. So he took them down to low elevation, and sure enough, he found out that these strawberries weren't sensitive to day length, unlike regular strawberries. So they produced strawberry flowers all the time, as long as it wasn't too hot or too cold. So he said, wow, you know what? This could really cause a big breakthrough in strawberry production, because instead of just having these short day plants that fruit over these narrow periods of time, if they're day neutral or insensitive to day length, they're going to fruit over a real long period of time, particularly if we plant them in a location that's not too hot or not too cold. And California has those conditions. Along the ocean, it doesn't get too hot in the summer, and it doesn't get too cold in the winter. So they use these strawberries now, and you can plant them, and the first year they produce fruit, and in the second year they can produce fruit. So this is like a new thing, a big revolution, and it sort of really took off. And there are these competing programs in the East and in the West. And breeder Gene Galetta in the East had a different breeding strategy than Roy Springhurst, who was a strawberry breeder at UC Davis. In the East, and this would be true for Washington as well, and Oregon, the emphasis was on perennial strawberries, it was on flavor and eating quality, breeding for soil resistance, disease resistance, vigor, and they didn't want to have to fumigate and didn't want to use plastic, and they used these dormant plants for transplanting. So the idea was in the East was like, we're going to go for flavor and quality, and we're not going to worry about, well, we're going to go for flavor and quality, and we're going to do what we're going to breed for resistance so we don't have to fumigate. In the West, they had a completely different strategy, and this also played out in Florida too. And I'm talking West, I mean California here. We're going to plant them as annuals. We're not going to worry about perennials. We're going to take them out every year, and we're going to fumigate the soil in between our crops. And that way we don't have to breed for disease resistance. And we're not going to worry about flavor because we don't think consumers will really care about that. We're going to go for size and yield. And we're going to breed both short day and day neutral strawberries, and we're going to go to town. And what happened was that they did. Like the industry migrated pretty much to California and some to Florida, and they emphasized size and yield, and they didn't breed any resistance to diseases in their strawberries because they fumigated every year. And we can't do that in the North because we don't have enough growing season to do that. So the Western strategy went out. And the way they do this is pretty remarkable. Most people have no idea this is what happens with strawberries. They start strawberry plants in these low elevation nurseries in the Central Valley where it's hot. And what strawberries do when it's hot? They make runners. So that's how they propagate lots of strawberry plants. But those strawberry plants won't make flower buds because it's not cold enough. So what they do is they dig those plants from these low elevation nurseries and they move them up to these high elevation nurseries in the mountains where it's cooler and it's further north, so they get short day exposure. So then they make flower buds. Then they dig them again and they transplant them down to Watsonville, Oxnard, Orange County, San Diego, where they produce the fruit. So those strawberries that are producing fruit have already been moved a couple of times to different nurseries before they're planted out in the strawberry fields. In Florida, they do the same thing, except they bring strawberry plants down from Canada in October, where they receive short days and cool temperatures, and transplant them down into Florida. And they fruit them during the winter because the days are still short, and then they tear them out and fumigate and start over again. So that's how the strawberry production has evolved over time and has now become really concentrated in California and parts of Florida because they have ideal conditions for doing all these three steps. So this line here is what the production peak looked like in the 70s. You see it mostly peaked in April and May, and then production fell off. And then over like the next 20 years, that production curve flattened out and spread out. And now it's they have strawberries almost year round. There's just a few times of the year where they don't have strawberries in California. We hear a lot about flattening the curve. Well, California really figured out how to flatten the curve on strawberry production. So now it happens almost year round. But there's a price we pay for that. One is because they didn't breed for resistance to the diseases, they have to fumigate every year. And they used to use methyl bromide until just a couple of years ago. And even though methyl bromide was banned worldwide because it depleted the ozone layer, California strawberry growers applied for and got exemptions 12 years in a row. So they were the biggest user of methyl bromide in the world. And now finally it had to stop. So they use different fumigants now, but they were using a lot of methyl bromide. So that's one cost to having strawberries almost year round from a pretty narrow location. A second thing they do is plant on black plastic or white plastic, or they use plastic so they don't have to use herbicides. So they plant the strawberries through there and it helps warm them up and get them started early and get them some good growth. But there's a lot of plastic used in growing strawberries. And I did some little bit of math and figured out that every year, strawberry growers use enough plastic mulch to circle the world 12 times with a 4-foot wide sheet of plastic. And that doesn't include plastic that might be used for fumigating, because they usually tarp the fields with fumigant before they inject the fumigant to hold it in, or tunnels that they might grow strawberries in. So a lot of fumigation, a lot of plastic. Then remember I said these plants are dug up from high elevation nurseries and transplanted, bare rooted into production fields like this, or they're brought from Canada and planted in production fields like this. Those plants are pulled out of the ground and stuck back in that hot plastic, usually in the fall, usually in October, with the sun beating down on there. It's hot, and those strawberry plants need water. So they irrigate those fields for pretty much 2 weeks solid, because they need those plants to root. And on average, they use 500,000 gallons of water an acre in those first 2 weeks after planting those strawberries to get them to establish. And in areas where they grow a lot of strawberries, the water table has sunk and the land has sunk as well. So 500,000 gallons per week during the first 2 weeks, land is sinking a half a meter annually. And this is interesting, this is a telephone pole. This is where the land was in 1925 in California. This is where it was in 1955. This is where it was in 1977. It's just shrinking right down. And in those 4 years, they pumped out 10 cubic miles of water underneath California. That's not all used for strawberries, but really depleting the aquifer. And you know, pest management is an issue too. In Florida, strawberry growers typically spray every week from flowering in November through harvest. That's 22 spray applications they make on strawberries. And they're making progress in reducing it. They've been able to reduce it. About half the growers have reduced it by about 30%, maybe 50%, but that's still a lot of sprays. And it lands strawberries on that dirty dozen list from the Environmental Working Group. Now, I don't put a lot of stock in that, but the point is that the number of sprays on strawberries is pretty high when you grow them in these climates where it's warm and pests don't die through the winter and so forth. So pest problems also an issue. So we have these finely tuned production systems. In California, you've got specific cultivars. They're dug from those high elevation nurseries on specific dates. Sometimes they're put in refrigerated cars for certain periods of time to get chilling. They're planted on certain dates. In certain field locations along the coast of California, there's certain dates you plant. That system is so amazingly fine-tuned. Just everything about it is perfected. And as a result, they get extremely high yields. So there's a graph. The acreage in California has gone up, these green bars, every year, and the production has just skyrocketed. But like I said, we pay a price in terms of these environmental impacts. And if you've not been to California and seen the fields, it's pretty impressive when you see the acreage. But you know, this intensification of strawberry production isn't happening only in California. Same thing's happening in Europe. And some of you might recognize this map here. This is, to the top of the graph is Spain, and south is Africa, and then here's the Mediterranean Sea. I want to draw your attention. There's a little white spot right here in Spain. And we're going to get a little bit closer and see what that looks like. This is from Google Maps. You can do it yourself tonight. It's pretty cool to do. You're going to get closer and closer. And what you're seeing here are tunnels that are full of strawberries. So same sort of thing. Almost all the strawberries in Europe, North Africa, come from this one little tiny place in Spain where the climate's just ideal for growing strawberries, and they put them under these tunnels and they go to town. But it's a pretty high risk thing to put all your strawberry production in one little area, even though it might be an ideal area for growing strawberries. So we have these two systems. We have northern strawberries, lower yields, perennial, harvest for 4 or 5 weeks. That's what a field looks like. You know, in New York, similar in Washington State. And which system is more sustainable, the one from California or the one from Northeast, Midwest, Northwest? I would argue that the latter is more sustainable when you take in all the factors that are involved. And you can list those factors: perennial production, annual production, and all the different inputs. Typically, perennial production, 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen a year. In California, 400 pounds is pretty average. So there's these big differences in input use between the two systems. So I wrote a chapter in a book with a fellow named Tom Shalin, who some of you might know. He was a professor at Washington State University probably 30 years ago, and then he worked for Driscoll Strawberries for a while. And we were in grad school together at Michigan State, and we wrote this chapter in a book on sustainable fruit production, except our chapter was about how strawberries probably aren't very sustainable, at least the way they're most commonly grown. So we did a life cycle analysis. We went to see how much energy goes into producing these strawberries and then delivering them to the dining room table. And we used New York as a place where these strawberries were delivered to because it's a big market, big consumer market. So you can go into the literature and find out how much carbon dioxide is produced per kilogram of fruit produced. And this is taking into account these production methods. You add 6% for the nurseries. Packaging uses another half a kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of fruit. And then you can figure out how much energy is used to transport those strawberries from the West Coast to the East Coast. And you add that all up. And it turns out that if you look at how much carbon dioxide is emitted, it's equivalent to like 22 pounds of glucose per 1 pound, 22 calories of energy in the form of glucose for 1 calorie of strawberry delivered. So 22 to 1. So that's not really a very good ratio. You spend 22 calories to get 1 calorie. But this is in glucose equivalents. And glucose produces a lot of carbon dioxide for each calorie of energy it releases. If you took something that was really efficient in terms of energy production per CO2 emitted, you could look at like diesel fuel. And indeed, a lot of the energy involved in a strawberry and growing it and moving it across the country is diesel fuel. So if you do the same calculation with diesel fuel and looked at how much CO2 is produced in diesel fuel per CO2 produced in growing a strawberry, diesel fuel contains 11 million calories. Anyway, you do the math, it's here, almost 20,000 calories of energy expended to grow and deliver 1 calorie of strawberry to the East Coast market. So I don't think those numbers are very good. To me, it's not very sustainable to grow strawberries that way. You know, we do it because we want strawberries year round. And because of that consumer demand, that's driven this whole system into this very high energy input production methodology. So most strawberries are grown with little crop rotation, with fumigation, lots of plastic, lots of energy, lots of water, lots of pesticides. Dependency on undocumented workers, we haven't even talked about that, but 50% of strawberry pickers are undocumented, and the product's grown far from consumers. And flavor is inconsistent. Most people don't say, oh, strawberries in the supermarket are always the best things I've ever eaten. You don't usually hear that. But you know, strawberry flavor has been something that's been controversial from the beginning. There's this variety called Wilson's Albany, developed in New York. It was really productive for its time, and acreage went from 1,500 to more than 150,000 acres in just 20 years. So growers really liked it. There's this preacher, Henry Ward Beecher, and he said, you know, this vixenish berry is enough to turn a horticulturist's heart against its kind. It's the wickedest berry that's ever indulged with liberty. It's an invention by which the producers make money out of the consumer's misery. Has every quality of excellence except in the matter of eating. So strawberries that look good, produce a lot, but don't taste good, have been around for a long time. So what we've tried to do in our research program is take the best parts of the annual plasticulture system from California and adapt them to the Northeast and Midwest, where land is less expensive, soils are more fertile, water is abundant, and consumers are close by. So here's some California varieties. We take them and we can grow them here in the East. And they do really well on black plastic. And the other secret to growing them well is to cover them with a plastic tunnel that we can use to keep the rain off. And this is something that you all might want to consider because you get a lot of rain too. And then when it gets cold, we can lower the sides. And we find that, you know, pollination isn't really an issue. Even when the sides are down and the strawberries are flowering, they can still pollinate under there. And we can pick strawberries into November. I mean, we can be wiping the snow off the top of those row covers and still picking the fruit. It's really amazing. So we're really excited about this technology and this combination of things. And we don't have to spray fungicides, even when it rains a lot, because those rain shelters keep the rain off. You don't get powdery mildew. And the fruit quality is really pretty tasty. And we're real excited about this. And it extends our season from 4 or 5 weeks to 5 months. So growers can now, you know, sell in supermarkets and roadside markets and have strawberries from June until end of October, early November. So here are just some of our fields. The latest thing we're doing is some research on different coverings. That pink covering there is kind of cool. I just spent $1,000 to get it over here from France. They make it over there, but what it does is it takes the wavelengths of light that are not used by the plant and shifts them into wavelengths that are used by the plant. So it'll take like green light, which plants reflect, it'll convert it into red and blue light that plants use. And under low light conditions like we get in the fall, at least in France, they've shown that it enhances production. So we're gonna see if it works for us too. We also have fabrics here that have these little reflective strips in them. I don't know if you can see them very well, but it's like shade cloth for greenhouses. And what it does is in the hot summer days, it reflects some of the light back and keeps the plants cooler under there, because if it gets too hot, as we talked about earlier, these day neutral strawberries don't produce flowers. So we want to keep it as cool as possible in the summer. So we use white plastic to reflect the heat, and then these little strips through the plastic covering to reflect the heat. So here's my table a few years ago after a strawberry harvest. And those of you who are familiar with the climate here, pretty impressive to get strawberries in November in upstate New York. So we put all of our information we learned in the strawberry production guide. You can download for free on the web if you're interested in trying this. I think it's pretty cool. The website's tunnelberries.org, and you can download it and read all about it. So just to end and conclude, I think these technologies from California, Florida can be used in other regions of the world in ways that reduce the environmental impact. These tunnels have tremendous advantages, particularly in extreme climates, but it really does help spread production out over a wider geographic area, so it's not all concentrated in one location. And we still have a ways to go. You know, we're still using plastic, both for mulch and for covering. So we're working to try to become more environmentally sustainable, but we still have these environmental impacts. The strawberries are still going to have a relatively high environmental impact compared to other crops that we grow. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and we'll open it up for some questions.